There might be quite a few who will be listening to this podcast who aren't familiar with Howard Thurman, and so I just wondered if you might be able to give us a bit of a short biography and perhaps also highlight some of the importance of his life to the church and theology in the US, maybe particularly amongst the black church within the US as well, because I know he's influenced quite some significant people in the past and present.
Yes.
So I'll hand over to you for a short biography as to who Howard Thurman is.
Well, let me begin with what I think is some of the important impact of Thurman on society and the life of the church that in many ways shapes who we are and where we are today. And we can go back and speak about the kinds of details that led to Thurman becoming such an influential person. Thurman was one of the first African Americans, if not the first African American, to meet with Gandhi. And out of that, there emerged a conversation about the power of nonviolence, both in the movement in India, but also the way in which it might in some way influence overcoming oppression in the United States. And Thurman is considered by many to be the one who really trumpeted the significance of nonviolence as a means for the civil rights movement in the United States. And it influenced such persons as Martin Luther King Jr. and many of those who were involved in the various movements in civil rights. I had persons who, for example, who were deeply involved in the Nashville movement to say there were two books they read in terms of understanding why they were doing this. One was the Bible, and the second book was Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, a book, by the way, which has, I think, influenced generations. It's not been out of publication since 1947, about the understanding of Jesus being one of the disinherited, empowering those who are the disinherited for God's call to matters of liberation, as well as exercising their true calling in life. So this is Thurman's influence in a variety of ways: a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., a mentor to many of those, not only in the civil rights movement, but in various professional roles that have shaped American life in government. He's really also a founder of Fellowship Church, which has been considered the first interracial, intercultural, multi-ethnic church in the United States in both membership and leadership, and which received international attention for the way in which it was really a signal example of the capacity to overcome matters of segregation that flourished everywhere in the United States, not just in the South, as so many people think, but throughout the country. And this was a church that he established in San Francisco in the early 40s, 1943, 1944. So these are just some of the highlights of Thurman's influence. He's written over 20 books. He spoke at hundreds of university campuses, has received so many degrees for his honorary degrees for his work, has really also received the kind of support from persons like Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an honorary member of his church, and very, very prominent figures, including our President Barack Obama, who identified Howard Thurman as a very influential figure in his own life and thinking. Howard Thurman was born in 1899 in Daytona, Florida, segregated South. He was basically being denied going to high school because they didn't offer 8th grade in his town. It was another one of those expressions of segregation and a way by which the city did not have to provide a high school if you couldn't have an 8th grade education that was compulsory for even entrance into high school. And he received special tutoring from a teacher who just so was enamored with his hunger for education that this tutor enabled Thurman to pass the 8th grade test, even though he was not an 8th grade student, in order for him to go then to a church-sponsored high school some miles away from where he lived. He graduated from there as valedictorian, having worked extremely hard to the point of exhaustion, really, and went to Morehouse College, which some of your listeners may know is also the college of Martin Luther King Jr., and was a student there where he graduated as valedictorian. He read every book in the Morehouse College library, every book. It was a kind of challenge that he and another student had with one another, and their fellow students would test them in the evenings around the dinner table as they would identify books to be certain that they were reading and how faithful they were to the challenge that had been put before them. And there he went to seminary, Rochester Theological Seminary, which only allowed 2 African-American students a year at the school, and Thurman was selected as one of those 2 students. Became a pastor in Oberlin, Ohio, was there for a few years before being invited to teach at Morehouse and to also be the dean of the chapel there. From Morehouse, he went to Howard University, which was the most prominent institution of higher education in the United States, had more PhD faculty than any other school in the country, established a reputation for the creative worship, implementing matters of the arts, liturgical dance, various forms of music, the way in which poetry was an integral part of the worship service, and made a profound impression upon students where they were not required to come to chapel, but chose to really fill the chapel to hear Thurman, who had this outstanding reputation as a preacher. It was his years at Howard that he took this pilgrimage to Burma and India in order to, it was a pilgrimage of friendship, and spent some, I think it's 6 months in the area teaching, listening, having a profound understanding of various religions and cultures, as well as offering what they were interested in as the perspective from an African-American population about faith, rather than one from the more privileged missionaries that they had experienced coming and teaching there. And it was from Howard University that he went and established, with another pastor, the Fellowship Church, of which I spoke, and then from Fellowship Church to Boston University, where he was Dean of Marsh Chapel and Professor of Spiritual Disciplines. His being Dean at Marsh Chapel was because he was, which was a status where he was the first African-American dean of a predominantly white institution in American life. And it was while there, he had a radio program. Thurman had been identified as one of the 12 outstanding preachers of the century, continued writing, continued to have this influence among so many figures, not just in terms of the university setting, but those who experienced him in his vast travels, that it was an amazing life that he had there at Boston University that concluded in 1965. And then he retired to San Francisco, where he lived until 1981. Just two other things, just to give you some sense of how important a figure Thurman has been to persons who have changed our history. Martin Luther King at one time listed Howard Thurman as one of the 10 most outstanding men in the world, and he was listing him among Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, and really identifying Thurman as providing a transformative understanding, not only of the call of faith for matters of justice and matters of affirming individuals and the change of society, but the power of Thurman, the authenticity of Thurman, was something that Martin Luther King considered unique. And Thurman and King had a relationship that had been cultivated over the years, and many consider Thurman to be really a kind of spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. So that's a close association. Absolutely. Of which I speak because I think people are most readily identified with King, but Absolutely. In his own merits, Howard Thurman was recognized as a major figure. And I'll just end by saying, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. has the largest papers project in the United States, the collection of his letters, of his speeches, of his writings that are then annotated and provided to scholars, but also to readers who are wanting a more in-depth understanding of Thurman. You know, it's a massive project, occurs over decades. Howard Thurman has the second largest papers project of any African-American in the United States. And in light of all of the prominent persons in this United States history, that is quite a tribute, I think, to Thurman's significance and the kind of legacy that he leaves us.